Hello, I am Aiden RMBD, and this presentation is for my Bio 414 Evolution class. This will be a pretty interesting one. We will be discussing lots of big movie star carnivorous dinos like the Tyrannosaurus Rex and the Spinosaurus. So without any further ado, let's get right into it. So this paper is titled Carnivorous Dinosaur Lineages Adopt Different Skull Performances at Gigantic Size. It was published in Current Biology, which is a scientific journal. It was written by Andre J. Rao and Emily J. Rayfield. Before we get into the presentation, I'd like to do a little vignette of all of the scientists involved. So this is Dr. Andre J. Rao. He is a paleontologist at the University of Bristol, which is this historic university in the United Kingdom. His studies focus on, I believe, Cope's rule in theropods. So we'll get into what Cope's rule and theropods all are later down the line in this presentation. So this is Dr. Emily J. Rayfield. She studies the skull morphology of theropods using many modern analysis techniques. She also studies the University of Bristol. And one other interesting thing I found about her is that she actually was in a 2018 BBC special on an ichthyosaurs with the world-renowned documentary host and biologist Sir David Attenborough. So that was pretty interesting. So here are some take-home points. I determined them by reading through the paper, and I think these are very important points that the authors make, and they do a very good job of summing up the whole idea and themes behind this paper. So let's start. Number one, skull biomechanics are variable among large theropods. Finite element analysis, or FEA, was performed on the skulls of 18 theropods. Different bite strategies are hypothesized to have been used among theropod groups. And there is no consistent link between body size and bite strength. And Mesozoic ecosystems allowed for the diversification of many different predatory niches and strategies. So I will be reading the full abstract, or as they call it, summary of this paper. Deep breath. Let's go. Theropoda is one of the most extensively studied dinosaur clades, including iconic carnivores such as Tyrannosaurus rex and Spinosaurus aegyptiacus. The clade includes the largest terrestrial bipeds ever described, including 3 lineages that independently achieved giant size: Megalosauroidea, Allosauroidea, and Tyrannosauroidea. Here, we investigate how increasing size influenced feeding performance by quantifying feeding-induced mechanical performance across numerous large theropods using 3D finite element analysis. Unexpectedly, we discovered a divergence in functional strategy among the 3 lineages that led to gigantic top predators. In non-tyrannosaurid theropods, skull stress generally did not increase with size, in contrast with tyrannosauroids, who experienced greater stress due to increased muscle volume and bite forces. When skulls were scaled to equivalent size, smaller theropods, particularly basal taxa, experienced higher stresses. Despite similar scaling constraints, theropods adopted 2 distinct functional and likely ecological strategies: increased size with reduced stress, or increased skull size, muscle volume, and bite force at the cost of higher stress. Giant tyrannosaurids uniquely maximized the bite force despite elevated cranial stress, a strategy perhaps driven by the demands of subduing increasingly large and mobile prey in the late Cretaceous. Alternatively, or additionally, this shift may reflect ecological displacement by coexisting predators such as smaller theropods and giant crocodiliforms. Whatever the cause, tyrannosaurids pursued a high-risk, high-reward feeding strategy unlike any seen in their early Cretaceous counterparts, underscoring a profound shift in megacarnivore evolution near the end of the Mesozoic. So I'd like to highlight some glossary notes. These are some key vocabulary words which I think are very important in understanding this paper. First is paleontology. You may know what this is. This is the study of fossils and prehistoric life. And a theropod, which are one of the three dinosaur clades, along with sauropods and ornithischians. So mostly these are all the carnivorous dinosaurs that walk on 2 feet, and including lots of the very famous ones like Velociraptor or T-Rex. And all modern birds we have today belong to this clade. And then biomechanics, study of mechanics and physics and effect on biological systems, and the functional morphology, which is the study of the relationship between the structure and function of body parts. So throughout this paper, we will be having these textbook tie-ins, which are concepts that were highlighted in the textbook for this class that I think are important in understanding this paper, and I relate to it in a key way. This comes from figure 18.5, and it is an overview of the Phanerozoic eon, just a large stretch of time from around 540 million years ago to now. I've cut out all of the Paleozoic periods, and we're only really focusing on the Mesozoic, which is right here. This comprises of the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods. These are the times when non-avian dinosaurs existed. They evolved maybe around 230, 240 million years ago in the Triassic, and they went extinct with the KT extinction. And I think the most important event on this chart, on this slide, is the second dinosaur radiation. It takes place around the Cretaceous, around the late Jurassic, early Cretaceous, and it is through this radiation many of the forms we see in this paper came to be. This is the first figure of this paper. This is a phylogeny of theropod dinosaurs. We can see that this covers throughout the long stretch of the Mesozoic period, starting in the Triassic and ending in the Cretaceous period with the extinction of non-avian dinosaurs. So you may notice 3 small tick marks, of these very small little tick marks that are coming around near the bottom of this slide, almost like a sort of ruler. And these tick marks, each one marks 1,000,000 years. The Mesozoic, I believe, lasted for near 160 million years. And if we zoom in, this looks pretty complicated, but we can zoom in to chew this figure down into some bite-sized elements. So the long bars represent the time periods when fossils of the species, of the relevant species, have been found. For example, if we look at the one example I put, this is Acrocanthosaurus. It lived near the end of the lower Cretaceous or early Cretaceous period. And you may also notice some of small dots near each of the taxa. These dots indicate that FEA, or finite element analysis, was done on the genus. So 18 genera were examined in this study, the ones with those little dots, like I mentioned earlier. The technique they used was called finite element analysis. So you may be asking, what even is finite element analysis? But sorry, we'll get to that later. But now, let's play a dinosaur taxonomy trivia game. So I could just be lecturing to you on and on about the different taxonomy of dinosaurs, and you'll probably be rolling your eyes. But let's make this fun and interactive by playing a little game, and I promise it won't be too hard. So this is a Tyrannosaurus rex, the famous king of the dinosaurs and probably among the most iconic animals who have ever lived on this planet. What family or superfamily do you think it is in? I'll give you a few seconds. You can even pause this video if you want. Think about it. All right, so it should be pretty obvious. This is in Tyrannosauroidea, the family that's been named after this iconic animal, and the obviously the Tyrannosaurids, the family that includes Tyrannosaurus and its relatives like Gorgosaurus or Albertosaurus, are in this family, along with some smaller ancestors and sister groups. So this is Allosaurus. This is the big famous predator of the Jurassic period. What superfamily do you think it belongs to? This also looks pretty obvious. I'll give you a few seconds. All right, pretty easy. This is Allosauroidea, named after Allosaurus. There's also some other theropods in this group that existed throughout the Cretaceous period as well. So this is Spinosaurus, the famous for its large sail-like back and its almost crocodilian-looking bill. What superfamily do you think it's in? And it's not named after this animal. And I'll give you a little hint. It is a very big dino, probably I think it was recently said as the largest theropod in terms of like of length. I'll give you a hint. All right, it is a Megalosauria, and the Megalosauroids covered throughout this paper are mostly Spinosaurids, like these sort of like almost crocodilian-looking dinosaurs that hunt in the water. So I've had some new vocab words we have. So these vocab words are basal and derived. Basal is these are key, very important words in evolution when looking at the large, fine scale of macroevolution. So basal are branches in a phylogeny that branched out earlier and are pretty old, whereas derived are newer innovations that appear in the taxa. And for these theropods, it's gigantism, or just being very, very big. So the researchers did something I think that was um, pretty scientific of them, and they used these sort of basal taxa as a control, just as a little explanation of like this the general theropod body plan. They used three taxa, like I highlighted two of them in this slide. Herrerasaurus, which is one of the oldest theropods known. It was probably lived around 230 million years ago in Argentina. And this is Dilophosaurus, another early theropod of the early Jurassic period. And gigantism evolved multiple times across the evolutionary history of these theropods. So the ancestors of the groups that I highlighted in red, those little red highlights, are all of the major gigantic groups. Like you see the Tyrannosaurids, the Megalosaurids, and the Allosaurids. Their ancestors were all not that big. They all had a very, very tiny common ancestor in the Triassic period. So all three of these lineages evolved giant size in a form of convergent evolution, where unrelated species evolved different similar body plans to handle similar environmental pressures. This is actually a pretty well-known phenomenon in paleontology, as we look and see like more recent taxa are larger and older taxa are smaller. And this has a name. This is called Cope's rule. It was named after Edward Drinker Cope, who was one of the main figures of paleontology during the 19th century. He discovered lots of dinosaurs out in the West and lots of other animals too. And this rule applies to many, many different animals, not all animals, but the ones we highlighted, like this example here, makes this rule in horses. So we have ancient horses, which are very, very small creatures, which over time, horses became larger and larger until we got to our modern horses in the genus Equus we have today. And we can see this rule in action with our theropods as well. So this little creature right here is called Dilong. It is an animal lived around maybe 125 million years ago in China during the early Cretaceous. It's probably shorter than a human. And it and its relatives eventually evolved into the massive Tyrannosaurus rex, a massive monster like this. So yeah, this is Cope's rule. Basically, we get from small to big over evolutionary time. So now let's get into the real meat and potatoes of this paper, and probably the most boring part, what they did as their methods. And they used a technique called finite element analysis, or FEA for short. So this technique is pretty commonly used in engineering to test out materials and parts of machines, but we're using it in these theropods because obviously we don't have any living theropods wandering around that we can test and crush, and we can analyze their genetics and all that. So this is the best approximation that we have. So in this method, we have a virtual 3D object. You just basically put an object through a CT scan and it'll create like a 3D model of it. And then FEA software will break it down into these tiny shapes called finite elements. And then equations are applied and solved by a computer, which will generate a color-coded 3D map of this object that explains the different colored regions, explain how the object reacts to forces in these different regions. So this analysis simulates the feeding done by these dinosaurs. So it's applying the forces, it's looking at the forces that are applied on the skull as the dinosaur feeds. So this is just a little supplementary figure that explains the anatomy of these organisms, like what the attachment sites for muscles in their jaw, on the jaw and cranium must have been. Here we have the cranium and the mandible, which is the lower jaw, and the cranium, which is the big upper skull. Made some glossary notes about. So this is figure 4 of this paper. It's sort of a phylogeny like the one we had earlier, except it only covers like the 18 species that we're discussing that were put through FEA. It adjusts for size, like different organismal sizes, as well as the phylogenetic um, connections we'll discuss later down the line in the presentation. And one thing I'd like to highlight is the von Mises stress, which is in the unit of megapascals of pressure. And what this is that the portions of the skull with cooler colors, like the more reds and the more, greens and blues, have a low stress, and the warmer colors, like the red and the magenta, would have higher stress in their studies. So this is just larger models of these skulls we can examine. Like, and if you see the gray, that gray on the skull indicates that's the closest point to failure, like its lowest stress or the highest stressed actually. So you see we have our basal taxa over here, our allosauroids, our megalosauroids, and our tyrannosauroids. And the tyrannosauroids are unique because the scientists actually used two specimens. They found two skulls in two different museums of different individuals, and they decided to use two different specimens. So this is our second textbook tie-in we have. This is on phylogenetically corrected regression analysis. And what this technique entails is that typically in statistics, we see our points, our individual data points for individuals as like different things, like they're all entirely different. But this method attempts to sort of reconcile that with our evolutionary understanding of taxonomy of how species relate to one another. It attempts to correct, like add another layer of it, saying that we can have closer connections to species that are more well related. And one key thing the book does in explaining this technique is they used a very interesting study done in 1998 by David Hoskin on gray-eared flying foxes. So Hoskin noticed that these foxes, that they're a social animal, they live in groups, and that the males living in larger groups have larger testicles. So he tried to see if there was a sort of correlation between testicle size, logarithm of testicle size, and group size, and there was a connection between testicle size and groups. And this implies that the males in larger groups would have to have larger testicles and thus more semen volume to have a better chance of reproducing because there's more male competition around. So it's a better chance of their genes getting passed on. And they ran this through a phylogeny and examined the corrections between this and other bats. And they found out, yes, some of you notice here, some of the larger species, the species that live in larger groups have larger testicles compared to the species that live in smaller groups. So this basically is an attempt to reconcile your stats with your phylogeny. So this figure looks pretty complex, intimidating, I meant. This is four graphs. It's obviously kind of hard to see, so we're going to zoom into this, make it a little bigger, a little smaller. So there's four graphs in one. So this graph, if we look at our x-axis, this highlights the cranium length in centimeters, and then the scaled mean cranial von Mises stress we discussed earlier. So if we look at this, we can see that our more basal theropods, like our Ceratosaurus and our Herrerasaurus, are up pretty high. They experience a lot of stress, as well as our more like smaller tyrannosaurids, like our Alloramus and Raptorex. And also one thing to note is that the yellow are basal taxa, the black dots are tyrannosauroids, the blue are allosauroids, and our red are megalosauroids. And we see some of the more larger species are pretty smaller on the stress axis, but there is no line connecting to these points, which usually implies there is no significant connection, and there is no significant connection. The researchers mentioned that in the paper. So larger size does not always mean more stress. So here is something pretty similar. It's except this time it's the mandible. It's pretty similar to what we had earlier. Here, this one's different. This also talks about the length of the cranium of the animals, but it also entails a new unit, a new measure on our y-axis called the scaled mean cranial max principal strain. This is a measure of the strain done on the animal's skull, this is unitless. You don't see any sort of parentheses implying the units. And you also see something pretty similar. Some of our like other genera that are up here, like Ceratosaurus and Alioramus, are more up here. And then we have some of our larger species down here with the lower amount of strain. Typically, we can see Tyrannosaurids when we're low, and we have our Allosaurids up here. And then this is something pretty similar except with the mandibles. So the main point, we don't have to get into all the nitty gritty, but because there's no significant connection between size and strength across the whole, between size of the jaw and the skull and sort of stress implied. So there's no really connection between those things. So even though there was no connection between the size of the skull features, like the mandible and the cranium, and the stress, the researchers were still able to find like a sort of trend of behavior of what these animals do and how they hunt. The researchers explained that the tyrannosauroids, like the bigger ones, like the T-Rex, would have higher tolerance towards stress because of the well-developed musculature and bone structure of their jaws. And this would be designed for force-intensive crushing of prey, like breaking of bones, and just cracking through the tough armor of the different ornithischians they hunt. Whereas the allosaurids and megalosauroids have a lower stress tolerance, thus they can't really bite and crush like the way a T-Rex would. So they would have to develop other strategies to hunt their prey, which we will be discussing later. So one question the authors had, and that I had while reading this, is that why did Tyrannosaurid jaws get so big and forceful in the first place? I think they mentioned that Tyrannosaurus rex has a bite force of 60,000 newtons. So they give off like two different hypotheses. The first one is competition with other predators. Like there's like at this time in the late Cretaceous, there were giant crocodiles, like the one I show here, and some other smaller theropods trying to compete for this niche. Another hypothesis they give is coevolution with a more well-defended prey. So as we see in the late Cretaceous, we have species like Triceratops or Ankylosaurus, which have large frills and horns and armor and big clubs on their tails. Lots of defensive strategies against big, powerful theropods like T-Rex. This is actually a pretty interesting phenomenon we see in evolution called the co-evolutionary arms race. So this is highlighted in the book using this like imaginary example of a pathogen, of a host evolving resistance to a pathogen, and then these pathogens get new genotypes to select for hosts that are weaker to the pathogen. And this occurs in some predator-prey and parasite-host dynamics. Basically, the prey will get a new feature, and the predators will compensate by getting a new feature to hunt the prey. And the same thing is true with parasites and hosts. This is a very common phenomenon in evolution. So now that we explained how the tyrannosaurids hunt, what about the taxa that experience higher stress, such as the megalosauroids or allosauroids? Well, what we currently are thinking is that spinosaurids, like Spinosaurus and its relatives, mostly lived in the water and hunted fish almost like a crocodile or a heron, where they would grab the fish using their jaws and have like these conical teeth to grab a hold on the slippery prey. Whereas, and also this would prevent them from competing with other large theropods. And with the allosauroids, what the researchers say on this paper is that they mostly evolved bites that were weaker in force, but they could serrate and slash off flesh from large animals like these sauropods here in this paleo art. So once again, I'd like to reiterate the take-home points that we've explored throughout this paper. That skull biomechanics are variable. There's lots of different ways the skulls evolved and different strategies the predators used. The FDA was performed on these skulls, and that different strategies were hypothesized to have been used, which one of the key conclusions that the researchers came to. There is really no consistent link between body size and strength. We easily saw that through our graphs. And Mesozoic ecosystems allowed for the diversification of different predatory niches and strategies, which we saw through our megalosauroids, our tyrannosauroids, and our allosauroids. Thank you for listening to this presentation, and hope you have a good day.